Hi, I'm Devin Susi, a senior journalism major. I just wanted to bring up the point of gun violence, especially after the latest incident in California. Why do you think nothing has successfully been done to prevent this from happening, and what do you personally think would be the most effective way to stop it?
Your turn.
Thank you. I think we need more sensible gun safety laws, and I think there's some common ground that Congress can reach. Gil and I disagree on guns to some extent, but we recognize there's common ground. He and I can agree on some things. And I'd like to see better background checks to cover every place that a gun is sold. I don't think assault weapons should be legal in private hands. I'd like to eliminate the extra capacity magazines. Any weaponry and support things like magazines that have essentially military use don't need to be used by sportsmen or hunters, and aren't necessary for self-defense. Gil's going to make a very good point about how the Second Amendment
I'll make it.
okay, gives people the right to defend themselves. And I think the Second Amendment surely protects individual ownership of rifles in this country, but we need to do a much better job with sensible gun safety. And I think President Trump's got the status to make some progress. It's like Nixon going to China. Trump really could work with some rational gun safety advocates in both parties to make some progress.
There's several problems with the gun debate, and as Joe mentioned, I've owned guns most of my life. I'm comfortable with guns. My kids are comfortable with guns. There are really two universes. There are people who were raised around guns and feel comfortable with guns and understand the Second Amendment, and there are people who weren't raised around guns and are intimidated by them and don't think anybody should own guns. I mean, that's a simplistic definition, but I think, and both sides, it's like one side is speaking English and the other is speaking Urdu. I mean, they can't really talk to each other. Joe and I would agree on this, and frankly, I think the NRA and most of its members would agree that guns should be kept out of the hands of people who should not have guns, all right? People who have mental problems, and if you look at most of the gun violence that gets the news, like the most recent event, these are people who had deep psychological problems. They should never have had access to the guns. And as I say, I think the NRA agrees with that. The NRA has fought for, when I was in the state legislature, for longer mandatory sentences for criminals who commit crimes repeatedly using firearms, okay? Those are people who should not be allowed to get firearms, and yet somehow some of them get them. There are areas where we could agree on some things, but I believe that the unvarnished truth is that there are interest groups on both sides who fundraise off the issue, and they have an industry to try and protect, and so they don't want to see some of these compromises reached, and they just argue past each other.
Hi, Ben Crawley. I'm a junior journalism poli-sci major. So my question is, after Anita Hill hearings in the 90s, a lot of women ran and won in Congress, and there was almost like a feminine wave hitting Congress. Now, after these midterms, there's a record number of women in Congress. Do you think that this is due to the Me Too movement and Kavanaugh hearings? And how do you think that more women in Congress will affect laws being made?
I guess I go first on this. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. That's an interesting observation, and I think it's true. What effect it will have long term, we really don't know. I mean, if you look at the last wave, and you really look at what the results were, it's hard to see a lot of evidence of real results. This time it might be different, but do understand that, some of the women who won are conservative, and they may be overly. If you compared them all, I'll grant that probably more were liberal than conservative, but it's not a monolith. And I think sometimes we have this, and particularly the media, and I'm not saying this just for your benefit, CJ, but I think the media likes to pigeonhole people. And I loved some of the things he said about vets. You know, they're all across the political spectrum, and to put them all in one pigeonhole and say they're a monolith, I think is a mistake. So I do believe that women bring a different perspective sometimes, just in general. And I will be sexist here, but there are differences between men and women, and so they might bring a different perspective. And it may be refreshing to the Congress. I think time will tell.
I think Congress needs to reflect the diversity of the country. So that means more women, more minorities. It just has to be good for the operation of a deliberative body to have that body reflect what the population of the country is. I think they'll be up to 100 women in Congress. Is that right? I think that's the number I've heard out of 425. So it should be closer to 200, I suppose, if it's an even split. It just has to be better. And the fact that some are liberals and some are conservatives, that's fine. I mean, that's not the point at all. And do women have a different perspective on war or nurturing or education? Yeah, I suppose so. Is it better? I don't know. But the public expects certain things, and their elective bodies ought to reflect their makeup, so they can listen to the messages and get the message.
Up here in the bleachers.
Thank you. All right. Within healthcare, the Reproductive Health Care Act has sparked debate about whether or not government should be permitted to interfere with reproductive rights. Do you think that government should be allowed to have a say in these rights?
I think it's your turn.
Okay. Throughout my career, I have always been pro-choice. So I have wanted to limit the role of government in making reproductive choices for women. I think women should have the power to make those decisions in consultation with their doctors. I trust women to make the right decisions. I don't want to dictate what they are. So that's something that I've always thought was in the best interest of the public, to let those difficult decisions be made without the politicians getting in between women, their doctors, and their families.
Well, there are really several questions embedded in your question. And I come at the whole issue from a different perspective than Joe. But as I say, one of the reasons we're here is to demonstrate that it is possible to disagree without being disagreeable. I think the issue, from my perspective, is really about what should taxpayers be required to pay for. And whatever your view of the matter is, you have to acknowledge there are strong feelings on both sides. And so from my perspective, the issue is what role the taxpayer should play in that decision, and my answer is very little.
Hi, I'm Brittany Dixon. I'm a senior journalism major. So obviously we know your views on abortion, but do you too support the other services that Planned Parenthood provides, such as STD screenings and things like that?
Short answer, no. I mean, the truth of the matter, all of that can be done by other clinics. I mean, it's not as if we have a shortage of those kinds of facilities. And from my perspective, if we could get an objective accounting of the revenue and the services provided, and I may be prejudiced on this, but my view is that it's overwhelmingly about abortion. And so in terms of STD testing and so forth, there are multiple public clinics that do that same thing, and they do it at very low cost.
I do favor a government role in that. I favor government support for family planning services, which would include the services that you mentioned. I think that's very appropriate. Whether you agree with the decision or not, and the Supreme Court may change the decision. The Roe v. Wade decision said that women have a right of privacy that extends to making these reproductive decisions for themselves, and it flows from that's true regardless of their ability to pay. If it's a constitutional right to have control of your own reproductive decisions, then I don't think there should be a limit. That right should be limited because you don't have the money. So that would lead me to be in favor of public funding for those matters.
Tiger?
Hello. I saw you guys earlier in
Noah?
Yeah, my name is Noah Ash. I'm a poli-sci and journalism major. So in Massachusetts, we recently just passed a ballot bill that would allow, that would actually prohibit gender discrimination. And I just wanted to see what your opinions on gender discrimination were.
Well, I'm against it. I'm against discrimination in all its ugly forms, against it in housing and voting rights and public policy matters. And I think gender identity, sexual preference should be included. We've had big debates in Pennsylvania about whether to add gender protections to our or identification to our hate crime law, and the legislature's been resistant. Well, I think that ought to be added. So I would be very supportive of eliminating those discriminations as much as we can.
As a father of two daughters, I'm in favor of, not allowing people to discriminate against gender. Okay. As a practical question, though, and that's where this gets difficult. The right of one person to swing their fist ends where the other person's nose begins, and that's where it becomes. Some of these issues can become a little more complicated than they seem on the surface. So, in general, I would agree with it, but I think we have to be careful that we don't create other problems. So that's not a very good answer, and I apologize for it.
Specifically, do you mind if I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
With transgender people specifically, what are both of your thoughts on that? They tend to be, I'd say, out of all the gender minorities, the most discriminated.
The question was whether trans-identifying people should be included in anti-discrimination protections. Yes, absolutely, from my point of view. Again, I mean, any minority has a right to be protected under our laws and to be heard in our political process. The majority is going to make the political decisions in our system, but people need to be heard, they need to be respected, and the laws need to protect their rights to function as equally as anybody else in a variety of areas, education, housing, and so forth, access to health care, as anybody else.
I don't disagree with that, and but we try to legislate against so many things. If we could just, if there were more common sense in the country, if you just treat people like you'd like to be treated, on both sides, all of a sudden these kinds of problems sort of go away, and we just don't seem to have that common sense anymore.
All right, we've got time for one more question. Have you already asked yours, or?
I did.
Okay.
Does anybody else want to go?
Anybody else? First time question?
CJ hasn't had a question.
I'm just glad to see members of two parties together in a simple fashion.
Without any bruises.
That's my statement.
Yeah, well, what's been you've disagreed on a range of issues. What's been the common ground you found today? What's been the biggest area of common ground?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question.
All right, you can weave that in, but I don't want to take away from Kayla, so let her ask first.
recently there have been some issues with press having their hard passes revoked from the White House, specifically Jim Acosta, and I'm wondering your opinions on if you think that that's unconstitutional and how you feel about CEN suing the White House for taking away his press pass.
Good question. Who wants to start?
I think the president's been just so irresponsible in his treatment of the press. Like many other groups, he attacks, he demonizes, he belittles, he's gone after the press. The press are human beings. They've turned around and gone after him. It's a very toxic relationship. Now, there's always tension between public official and reporters. You guys got to get used to that. You did a nice job when my esteemed colleague said, well, this is the truth, and you said, well, no, it isn't, and I'm looking at it right here. You were polite, you were professional, you didn't back down. You guys got to get used to that. But what you shouldn't have to get used to are demeaning comments. And by the way, I don't know whether Gil was right or you were right. I'm just saying you handled it well. You handled it well. You deserve respect. The president should not be demeaning the whole profession of journalism. Now, I saw the tape. Unless I didn't see the beginning of it, it just seemed out of the blue. The president started berating Acosta, and Acosta didn't back down. He had the microphone taken away from him. He did not put hands on the woman. That's what Sarah Huckabee Sanders, or whatever her name is, said.
Pushed her away.
Not much of a push. Not much of a push. Yeah. But then the mic was given to another reporter, and then Acosta jumped up again. He probably should not have jumped up the second time. I mean, he'd had his moment, and he'd lost it because the president was acting like a bully. So taking away his press pass is a huge overreaction. Frankly, I don't know whether CNN is justified in suing. I don't know what the law is there. Are they suing because it's a constitutional right or something? Yeah. Yeah, well, they may have a pretty good claim there.
Let me put it in perspective. This was the day after the election. Both Mr. Acosta, most of the people in the press room, and the President of the United States had been up late watching returns. They were tired. They were not in a good mood. Okay? That does not justify the behavior of either of them. Okay? I think all of America saw what happened, all right? Whether he pushed the intern or just used his arm to get her out of the way, it really doesn't matter. In either event, they saw both parties acting incredibly childish, right? The President of the United States should not have reacted the way he did. But Jim Acosta has no right to be rude in the White House at a press briefing, okay? So, sometimes sometimes adults behave like children. Now, whether or not he should have had his press credentials revoked, I don't know. To me, it seems like an overreaction. But I don't have to deal with Jim Acosta every day. If I did, I might have a different opinion.
But is it unconstitutional to him as a person of the press? Whose job
Have a
is
credential?
to challenge. He did, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if he's got a constitutional right to a press pass.
I suspect it will be decided by the Supreme Court, and how they will rule, I have no idea.
I have two questions. One of which, so it might not be unconstitutional, but could you at least say that that is a form of censorship? I mean, he took away the mic. He had an intern take away the microphone of a reporter that was basically criticizing him and challenging him, and from basically coming from a news network that is critical of him and his administration and his policies.
Right. Well, I think, I've dealt with the press for most of my adult life, okay? And there were times that I didn't like what the press did, and there were times that I did like. I mean, they wrote some nice pieces about me. The thing you have to understand about Donald Trump, and people say, well, he's not like any other president. He's not like any other president, okay? He's only been in public life in that circumstance for 2 years, okay? He came out of a business where it was a bare knuckle business. That's the way he does business, okay? It's bare knuckles. The way he negotiates is he says, to the other side, we're going to cut off both of your ears. How do you like that? And then they negotiate, and he leaves them with, most of both ears. But, when you have to understand, this guy is not, I said this from the beginning, it's like sort of like Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. He's not like any other president we've had in our lifetime. He comes out from a completely different world. He does not suffer fools gladly. Okay? A lot of other politicians will sort of blanch and back off against the press. He won't. And whether it's constitutional or not, I mean, the truth of the matter is, as far as he's concerned, Acosta's never going to get back in the White House. And even if he does, he's never going to get to ask a question because he feels like he was rude and abusive in his questions.
I asked if it was censorship, not unconstitutional.
Is it? Yeah, well, I guess you could say yes, it's censorship in that respect. But I would argue that part of Trump, he gets himself into trouble by being too available, by offering too many tweets, by offering too many opinions, okay? He is too accessible. He walks to the plane and he answers questions. Most other presidents pretend they can't hear them, okay? And he speaks from the cuff. I told the story earlier. One of the great presidents in in history that I've studied is Rutherford B. Hayes. Nobody remembers Rutherford B. Hayes other than the fact that he was one of the heaviest men ever to occupy the White House, and he was the first one to take to have a bathtub in the White House. But he said something incredibly important one time because he refused to debate his political opponents. And he was asked why he refused to debate his political opponents. And his answer was beautiful. He said, because I have to think before I speak. Where President Trump gets himself in trouble is where he doesn't think before he speaks.
I do think it's censorship, for sure. I mean, that kind of meets the definition of censorship. I really don't know about the constitutionality, and I don't know much about that lawsuit and what they're alleging. But the bigger question is, the president has to set an example. The president's supposed to be the grown-up in the room. Reporters are often very rude doing their job, particularly when we start to bob and weave or we don't answer the question. And you'd rather have a reporter be a little overly aggressive than a little under-aggressive. If you're under-aggressive, you'll never get through the bluff of the politician and you'll never get the story. So every politician has to know that, has to deal with it. And, Donald Trump is not a babe in the woods when it comes to the press. When he was a developer in New York, he used to call up the New York Post and say give a false name and say, I want to tell you what the great job Donald Trump is doing these days. So the guy knows how to manipulate the message, but when he's not getting the coverage he wants, then he goes ballistic. So instead of being the adult in the room, he's the third grader having a temper tantrum. We deserve better from our president.
Can I just say, though, that he's not the first president to take on the press. Read about Harry Truman. Harry Truman was, he took things incredibly personally. He wrote strong letters to reporters. So, this whole notion that there's a love fest is not true. And I agree that the president should behave a little more presidential. But on the other hand, that doesn't excuse what really, in my view, was very rude behavior by Jim Acosta. And it wasn't the first time. And so if this was a one-time occasion, I suspect everybody would forgive and forget. But it hasn't been.
It's a ratings thing for CNN. They loved it. Jim Acosta was on, interviewed by Wolf and interviewed by the guy with the white hair, Anderson Cooper, and they made a big deal about it that night. Jim Acosta became their star guest. So both sides are playing the game, and it's a game that I think all of us get kind of tired of seeing.
Right. All right, let's give the congressman a hand. Thanks for taking the time to be grilled here by the
Good question.
meet again with.
I
Yes.
was going to ask on both of you. So I'm the secretary of our university's chapter of function practice. I was wondering if I could get a picture of you both to post our Instagram page.
Sure.
Let's do it.
Sure. Come on up. We'll take a couple minutes break here and go to our next star guest. Thank you, guys. That was great.
Pleasure.
Covered a lot of ground.
Good questions.
45 minutes. That
Yeah,
was
it was.
great.
It went fast.
And they were fair. They were fair questions. They leaned clearly left, but they were fair. That's really all you can. Fairer than I get from Minneapolis Tribune, I'll tell you that.